Welcome to the Athletic FC podcast with me, Akinwolere. Arsenal are through to the semi-finals of the Champions League for only the third time in their history, and they had to beat the holders to do it. So how far does the 5-1 win on aggregate propel Mikel Arteta's project forward? And more crucially, can they go all the way in the Champions League? With us today, we have the Athletics art de Roche, Guillermo and Charlie Eccleshare. Charlie, you can understand their emotion, especially this result for Arsenal, giving, I guess, the pedigree of Real Madrid, the most successful team in the Champions League, and also the first time Arsenal have reached the semi-finals in so many years.
Yeah, you could say it's sort of the biggest overachievers in the Champions League against the biggest underachievers. You know, Arsenal have traditionally kind of punched under their weight. And yeah, first semi-final in a long time. Yeah, I think it's massive for the club overall, but also just the feeling has always been under Arteta that there's been progress. You know, they were looking this season to become the first team ever in Premier League history to improve on their points tally 5 years running. Obviously, they're not going to do that. So I think it was almost more important that, you know, if they were going to feel the sense that they were still moving in the right direction in this project, it was going to have to come from the Champions League.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'm having this up, but Arsenal now have a 100% record at the Bernabeu. I mean, the sample size is very small, but at least, last night, they became the only English side, I should say, to win there twice after that famous, obviously, win in 19 years ago. Now, there are lots of chat before this match and so much noise, the word remontada all the time, and Saka was also asked about it post-match. You know, how have these players and how has Mikel Arteta managed to quash that noise? Because there was a lot of noise coming out that, you know what, magic happens at the Bernabeu. You know what, anything could happen in this tie, you know?
Yeah, I think Mikel Arteta did speak before the game and was asked about the noise, and he said it was impossible to kind of keep that out. I think Arsenal found, the size of a club Real Madrid is. They realised that this week in terms of how much noise could be generated around this second leg. But you saw that the messaging from Arteta and his players, David Raya, in the pre-match press conference was all about going to win the second leg. And I think that was really interesting because, to be fair, I actually lost count of the amount of times they both said they were going there to win rather than to hold on to the lead that they already had and just kind of not lose by 3. But I think symbolically, as you mentioned, Ayo, to be one team who's won there twice in the Champions League, I think is special. And it's why when Gabriel Martinelli puts them 2-1 up, it means a lot more than just being a 2-1 lead. I think obviously the game was already done at that point, but to have that, I guess, stamped on your club, I think is quite a big achievement.
Yeah, Guillermo, the messaging after the first leg, and it felt really poignant after the match. You know, the interview with Carlo Ancelotti, the interview with Jude Bellingham, the interview with Modric saying, you know what? You know, we're going to go back to the Bernabeu. We're going to put on a show. This is Real Madrid. This is what we do. We love to fight. You know, there is no such thing as impossible. All those wonderful messages. But it just didn't seem to go the right way for Real Madrid. You know, what do you put that down to?
Well, annoyingly, I will say that in terms of football, and if we stick to the football, they had the same problems that they faced in the first leg. They were unable to produce enough chances. The game, they had a lot of difficulties trying to build up their game. I think that they hadn't a shot on target in the entire game in the 90 minutes. Which I think sums up really well what happened yesterday. I think that there was a lot of frustration within the dressing room because of that. Also because of the defensive instability. We spoke about that in 1 week ago in this podcast. I think Real Madrid didn't solve their problems yesterday, because there are a lot of problems. It's a long list, a very long list, and that's why it's difficult, even if you have in your side, on your side, the Bernabeu, the atmosphere, and the fans.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to dismiss the quality of the players that Real Madrid have. I was listening to a report just before I jumped on the podcast, and the commentator basically said Real Madrid's performance felt more hopeful rather than orchestrated. Is that what we talk about when we say perhaps this sometimes can be a team of individual players as opposed to a team that works cohesively as a structure?
Yeah, I mean, I think that compared to the last season, I think that the team lacks some personalities, some key players in key positions, and even with the Kylian Mbappe's arrival, we are always constantly talking about him, but it's not only about him, it's about the lack of Toni Kroos, Joselu, Nacho. I think that the system needs something else, and Ancelotti hasn't been able to overcome this need, or to accomplish the need of something else. Yeah.
Declan Rice has been fascinating these two legs, hasn't he, Charlie? Coming up clutch with two brilliant free kicks and then doing a lot of the hard work in this, driving the team forward. And also, I guess, what's really interesting season on season is that he seems to add a few extra notches to his game. Goals now again. I think this has equalled, I think he scored 7 goals this season, which has equalled his best season ever. There's still a fair bit of the season to go. I mean, how important was he over those two legs?
Yeah, I think it's particularly significant he did this in a European knockout tie, because last year I think the one knock you could have against Rice in what was a brilliant season, both numbers of goals and assists were really good last season as well, and general performances. But if you look at the two legs against both Porto and against Bayern, you could say, if you're being ultra critical of a £105 million player, did he do enough in those games? Because that is ultimately what you sign. You spend that kind of money on a player to deliver in the absolute biggest matches, not just to get goals and assists in other games. And the fact that he's done it in these two matches, it's just the perfect way for him to answer that reservation. I mean, he dominated the tie overall, alongside Partey, who I think over the two matches as well would come a close second as the kind of man of the tie. Maybe Lewis Skelly as well would be up there with Partey. But yeah, I mean, Rice, as you say, did two very different roles. He's probably going to have to do another different role in the first leg against PSG because Partey's suspended. But this was massive for him, and to do it against Bellingham as well. I mean, that was a real statement to say, like, I'm the main man here. He did exactly what you want from your record signing. Sensational.
Yeah, Art, Charlie makes a really interesting point. The price tag on Declan Rice, and people have always asked that question. Is he world class? Is he able to do it on the big stage? I mean, look, this is the most successful team in the Champions League, and at a point in which Arsenal needed someone to drive that team forward, he seemed to step up and I guess open up a global conversation about his skill set in the world game as opposed to the league game.
Yeah, I would say it's been more than just the two Champions League games. It's also been the little I guess Premier League game against Brentford on the weekend too, which might go slightly under the radar, but I think in each 3 of those games he's shown 3 different sides to his play. So obviously the set pieces in the first leg, but then against Brentford he's the game breaker. He's the one that carries Arsenal pretty much all the way up the pitch from his own box and then lays it off to Partey to finish and make it 1-0. And then, as you guys mentioned, I think he was everywhere at the Bernabeu. I think tackle after tackle after tackle. And there was that one recovery run he made to make sure he got a block on Bellingham's shot, which, if he didn't track that, could have been a really dangerous situation for Arsenal. So I think he's shown how multifaceted he is as a midfielder, and how, I guess, irrelevant the talk of whether he's a 6 or an 8 is, which is probably a big reason why he ended up choosing Arsenal anyway, because Mikel Arteta could see the amount of different, I guess, facets to his game.
Just in a macro sense as well, you think of the sort of big players and leaders and characters that Arsenal have lost for various chunks this season. He has really stepped up in the period where they've been without Saka, they've been without Odegaard, they've been without Havertz, now without Gabriel as another kind of leader of that team. He's, if you think of that period, kind of the turn of the year when it felt like they were dropping like flies and it was all sort of going wrong, he's stepped up. He's just kept on delivering consistently good performances and been available, crucially as well. I mean, it sounds flippant, but it's really important. When you give as much as he does in every game, to be able to do that and still just sort of recharge, go again, and he sort of carried the team at points. You think as well the goal at Old Trafford, he's become a real focal point for the team.
All right, let's talk about Bukayo Saka, and I want your honest opinion. When he attempted the Panenka, what was going through your mind? Because, there's another narrative here of this Arsenal team that, when the going gets tough and they need a result, sometimes mentally they struggle to get it over the line. Did you begin to, I guess, fear that by missing that opened the door for Real Madrid as well to come back into this?
Not 100%. So my initial reaction was just, oh no, rather than anything else. And then once the VAR, I guess, controversy around Real Madrid's shout kind of happened, I didn't really think about the Saka penalty, to be honest. I felt very comfortable in the way that Arsenal defended as a unit, as 11 players, because any cross that came into the box, Saliba and Kiwior did everything to get something onto it. I think there are a few times where Saliba got a toe on some crosses, and then Kiwior took a shot to the stomach as well. So I was quite comfortable with the way that Arsenal were defending, that they could keep a clean sheet. Obviously they didn't, because they actually gifted a goal away themselves. But for the most part, I wasn't too unsettled. After the penalty miss, it was more just, I guess, disappointment that he didn't convert. But then he ended up getting his chip in the end anyway. So it all kind of came to pass as he expected.
All right, Charlie, we'll talk about PSG next. But before we do that, let's talk about Jakub Kiwior. Much has been made of the fact that Gabriel, Arsenal's star defender this season, is going to be injured for some big ties. And, I looked at the first leg against Real Madrid. I guess the first 4 or 5 minutes, Kiwior looked a little shaky, but you'd understand that under the circumstances. But feels like this is a young man who has grown into his position. But also, actually, I remember certain points last season where Kiwior had to fill in at certain points, as a left back, or maybe at times he's been seen to be able to step up, but just not find that consistency as a first team player at Arsenal.
Yeah, I mean, again, just drawing a comparison with last year's quarterfinals, it was against Bayern that at that point it felt like that kind of ended his Arsenal career, because he'd actually been the left back and been doing pretty well for an extended period, and then he came up against Sane and Gnabry, and the pace of the Bayern attackers, he looked really out of his depth, to be honest. And I think that fed into why a lot of fans were feeling really nervous about having him against Real Madrid. And it's only 9 days ago, ahead of that first game, a lot of fans were still doing the gymnastics of, could you play Ben White there? Could you move Timber there? Maybe could Arteta play? Could he drop it? It was all happening. Such was the desperation for Kiwior not to play. I'm obviously slightly exaggerating, but, there was a lot of nervousness about him. And as you say, start of the game, he made a mistake in the first leg, and it felt a little bit like, is this going to be Bayern all over again? And bear in mind as well, he's probably the fourth choice left-sided centre-back after Gabriel, Calafiori and Tomiyasu, you would have said at the start of the season. So for any team to be playing their fourth-sided, fourth choice centre-back, and that's leaving aside the right-sided ones, and to do this well, on top of Marino playing as a striker, having never played there, it's kind of amazing. But yeah, he's sort of completely stepped up in a way that someone like Philip Senderos did the last time Arsenal, got so far in the champ, or beat Real Madrid, in that mad 2006 run. Like, sometimes you need that in a run. Things don't go your way. I mean, remember Chelsea won against Bayern in 2012. They were missing pretty much all their defenders, had David Luiz on one leg. Players have to step up, and Kiwior's been that guy. Like, he was outstanding in both of these games.
Yeah, Guillermo, before you go, an opportunity for you to get one back on Arsenal fans. Well, hypothetically anyway. Talk to us about the rumours about Real Madrid being interested in William Saliba. This week on The Athletic, we reported on Madrid's interest in the defender. But is it a move that you can see happening this summer, or maybe something to keep an eye on further on down the line?
So, yeah, as we reported last week, Mario Cortegana's The Athletic, Real Madrid are following William Saliba. It's not something new. They have been following him before he joined Arsenal a few years ago. He's obviously one of the top central backs, maybe, or probably the best nowadays. So obviously Real Madrid are taking a look. They are scouting the central back market. So we will have to see. We are not sure that in this summer transfer window, in the next summer transfer window, they will go for sure for a central back, because it's not clear that they have this signing under their plans. But we shouldn't discard this idea for the next transfer windows, maybe for 2026, when William Saliba will have only 1 year left of contract, and it will be easier for Real to negotiate with Arsenal and to probably get him for a lower price, a lower cost. Is something that they usually do. They have done this in the past with other signings, for example with Thibaut Courtois, and it was much easier and cheaper, and I think it proved successful. Yeah.
No, I just wondered if it was kind of the perfect outcome for Arsenal with Saliba. Did make this error, get Real Madrid off the scent? Like, look, he's not that good, like he's always gaffing like that. Was it kind of Agent Raya, give him a bit of a hospital pass, let him make the mistake, and then Real Madrid, they can turn their attentions elsewhere? It's
exactly.
Very clever from Raya.
It's very smart, very smart. I see what they're doing there. All right, Guillermo, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate you, mate. Yeah, Charlie, let's break down Arsenal's route to the final. PSG next up. Clearly top class under Luis Enrique. They've been brilliant, and actually a lot of people are tipping them to potentially win this competition. But we spoke about this recently. I guess a degree of vulnerability when it comes to defences. I saw a couple of long balls played over by Aston Villa that caught them out, interestingly. And, it was a much closer call than I thought against Villa at Villa Park.
Yeah, I think the dial slightly shifted on PSG sort of throughout the game, because when they went 2-0 up, there was a huge amount of excitement online about PSG, and they're the favourites, and oh my God, they're this incredible counter-attacking team. Then they suddenly did look very vulnerable. They conceded 3. They could easily have conceded more. It was a bit of a collapse. And that's not to say that's definitely going to happen again, but it does. I think it does change a little bit how much Arsenal, or certainly their supporters or sort of general observers, would be feeling about PSG. I mean, I think it's a really interesting matchup in that you've got this incredible counter-attacking team against a team whose superpower really is stopping counter-attacks. There's pretty much no one better at doing that than Arsenal. So, kind of what wins out of those two? But it's, of course, it's a really challenging game. That said, I do think to be in the semis and therefore not to be any of Real Madrid, Liverpool, Man City, obviously not this iteration of Man City, but, there isn't a kind of aura team left in, I don't think. Obviously Barca, Inter, PSG, these are all great teams, but none of them have won the Champions League, especially recently. Even Barca, it's a decade ago, which feels kind of mad. There's not a team that I think Arsenal will be really afraid of. Which might not have always been the case when they've got to the last 4 previously.
Yeah, do you feel that there's not a team left that Arsenal should be afraid of left in this tournament? Would you think this current iteration of an Arsenal team should feel confident whoever they come up against in the competition?
Yeah, I think the aura comment that Charlie made is probably a big one, because they faced the last aura team in the Champions League and knocked them out, and deservedly so. So I think that should empower them as a club, give them the belief and the, mindset that they can, go against anyone in Europe. But I think when you look at them and PSG and that matchup, I think a lot of people have spoken about how this is going to be a different PSG team, but this is also going to be a different Arsenal team. I don't think people actually remember At the time, Martin Odegaard was out injured, so Arsenal were playing a 4-4-2 with I think it was Declan Rice and Thomas Partey as central midfielders, and Leandro Trossard and Kai Havertz as two strikers. That's not going to be the way they set up.
It was before Mikel Arteta became the best player in the world, I think. So that will make a difference.
Yeah. So I think people should keep in mind that it's going to be a different Arsenal as well. And it's an Arsenal that have proven how disciplined they can be against attacking forces, like they did against Real Madrid. So I think for Mikel Arteta and his players, they'll probably keep the focus on themselves. But if the game does kind of go into a frenzy where PSG's attacking talent are on top, I think they'll probably back themselves to match them defensively as well.
Yeah. What about if, I'm not trying to dream too far ahead now, Charlie, but if Arsenal do make it past PSG, well, awaiting them is either Barcelona, who they lost to in the Champions League final in 2006. And I remember that very vividly. And also Inter, who they played in the tournament in the league phase so far. Inter won that game 1-0. It was a tight one, but Inter, you know, for a lot of people, they're talking about Inter being this incredibly balanced team. And that's quite interesting because Arsenal actually unbalanced as a team. So, you know, where would you see that go? Who would Arsenal want to play? Yeah. Barca, free-flowing, Inter, super structural.
Yeah, I think if you look at the teams Arsenal tend to struggle against, it's more an Inter than a Barcelona. Like, it's that kind of, you know, obviously Inter are at a different level, but it's kind of mid-blocks. I mean, Arsenal have lost so few games across all competitions, despite it being a really difficult season in lots of ways. But it's, you know, Newcastle caused them loads of problems, Bournemouth. Their record against Big Six, in inverted commas, teams is incredible. You know, they haven't lost in the league for almost exactly 2 years against one of those teams. So I think a sort of free-flowing attacking team might scare them or be less challenging to the way they play than a team like Inter, who I would say are better than a Barcelona at kind of sitting in. I think that's when Arsenal have struggled, and maybe part of the reason, you know, the champion. It's weird because you look at the period since Havertz got injured, they've really scored very few goals in the league. And yet in that time, they've gone and put 7 past PSV. They've put 5 past Real Madrid in 2 games. And that has to be a little bit to do with how the teams on the continent approach them compared to teams at home. Same with someone like Sporting, who Arsenal put 5 past away in the group phase. So, I don't know. I think it might be that I don't know about prefer to play Barcelona, but certainly there'd be positives given that in theory Barcelona are the stronger team out of those two.
Okay, who's on your bill to win the whole tournament? Dare I ask you that question?
Hospital pass.
Who are you saying? Who are you saying? Be honest. Be truthful.
Am I allowed to plead the fifth?
Come on, stop knocking and diving. I need to know. I'm so fascinated.
To be fair, I actually agree with Charlie that Inter would be a tougher final if Arsenal got there. But I'll be bold and say Arsenal. That's me being bold. A little
whisper it quiet.
I do it. What you say, Charlie? Who's out of those 4 teams? Barcelona, Arsenal. Obviously, I've forgotten who. PSG, Inter. And Inter. Who's your winner out of those 4?
Yeah, I do think one thing that is exciting about this last 4 is there isn't an obvious favourite, as there often is. You know, if you've got Real Madrid knocking around in the last 4, you think they'll find a way. I think Barcelona would be my favourites, but I do think there's very little in it. I was talking earlier with Duncan Alexander on Totally, and the Opta supercomputer has it very, very close with all 4 teams. You know, there isn't a big favourite, there's not a big underdog. Interestingly, they have Barca actually as the 4th, as the kind of least likely to win it, and Arsenal is the most. So suddenly all those people who knock the supercomputer will be saying, yep, supercomputer always knows.
To be fair, one thing I'm actually looking forward to from PSG and Barcelona is their wingers. I just love their wingers. And I think they will bring entertainment to the semi-finals no matter what. Whether Arsenal whether Arsenal can stop Doué, Dembele, Kvaratskhelia, Hakimi, Mendes, That'll be interesting.
Without Partey as well.
Yeah, exactly.
And a question for you guys: Would you rather have lost 2-0 last night, but Partey's available for that first leg, or you'd rather it was as it was?
I think as it was, it
was.
is what it needs to be. I mean, there's a potential that even Marcelo Skelly could play in midfield. I don't know. Like I've seen him bomb in. That would be interesting, right? But that's another conversation for another time.
Actually, sorry. That made me think of something else. In that game in October, Calafiori actually played at left back. So this was before Lewis Skelly was actually in the team. And PSG couldn't deal with him because he was actually moving into midfield. There was one point where he was almost in a number 10 position playing in Bukayo Saka. So if he's able to get fit for that, whether it's the first leg or the second leg, for the tie in general, I think that could add another interesting dimension to how things play out.
Charlie, now despite the league being out of reach, and you mentioned it at the top, they are in the semi-finals of the Champions League. This is year 6 of the Arteta project. Do you think from the club's perspective the project is on schedule, ahead of schedule, or behind schedule? I don't know how you gauge it, because I would always ask myself, is winning the Premier League important, or now they're in the Champions League and there's a chance they win the Champions League? That would trump a lot of stuff.
I think you really can't overstate what a position they were in when he arrived in 2019. I mean, it was really, really wretched. It was terrible. And I think it's easy to forget of how far they've come in what is a relatively short space of time. These things do take a while, and they've become, by 2022, that 2022-23 season, they nearly won the league. They were going for the Premier League, and I think to be in the position where they're going for titles, they're in the Champions League semi-finals and, hammering Real Madrid, the champions of Europe, when at that point they were a joke, really, weren't they? I mean, they had so many sort of comedic players. They would play anyone good away from home. They'd look out of their depth. So I think, if you'd offered pretty much any, certainly supporter and probably people within the club that, fast forward 5.5 years and you'll be doing this at the Bernabeu, whether they go on to win or not. And I think as well, people can go on about trophies and whatever, and that's fine. If trophies are your absolute bottom line, go for it, enjoy it. But would you rather have had United's last couple of years? Not a chance. I would suggest there is barely an Arsenal fan who would, beating Real Madrid, beating Man City 5-1, beating Chelsea 5-0, doing the double over Spurs throughout the last 3 seasons. All of these things, they mean a lot to fans. And I don't think a League Cup for a team that's going nowhere, and Arsenal have been there. Arsenal were that team towards the end of the Wenger period. They were winning FA Cups. They were doing nothing in the league, nothing in the Champions League, if even in the Champions League. Arsenal have kind of lived through that. And I think whether they win the Champions League or not, from here on in, they're still in an incredible position by anyone's standards, but certainly relative to where they were. And so much of that is down to Arteta. I think it's his first job in management. Yeah. That's still slightly beggars belief. When he came in, it was sort of the club is basically banking on him being as good as Guardiola. That was kind of what they were saying, and he sort of has been. How insane is that?
No, I think you're spot on. There was post-match, there was an interview with a Spanish journalist, and he asked him, if he got any advice from anyone for the semi-finals, and he said he gave Guardiola a call, and it's because of Pep he's where he is. But this is his first job in management, having to take the club from where it was to where it's at right now. You've lost the sporting director. I mean, there's so many permutations here. But also, I guess, and I sometimes try to put this as perspective with certain Arsenal fans, is that with a relatively depleted team, you still kept this team in second place and in contention for Champions League again next season. I mean, it can't be underestimated just how hard he's worked for this, but also how decent a job he's done for his first managerial appointment.
Yeah, I think if we just look at this season in particular, everyone's now forgotten about the injuries that Arsenal have dealt with throughout the season. Odegaard, Calafiori, Timber, Saka, Havertz. I think there's probably loads of other ones that I myself am forgetting right now. But Arteta had to kind of mould this team a few different ways throughout the season. 4-4-2, as you mentioned. in the autumn. Then they were able to maybe for a few weeks go back to normal when Ødegaard came back and when Gabriel Jesus had his kind of purple patch around Christmas, but even he suffered an ACL injury. And now we're seeing this iteration where Mikel Mourinho's up front, and we're just seeing, a kind of mismatch of a team take on Real Madrid and beat them. And I think when you kind of consider all of that and what they've had to deal with this season, it is quite amazing that they are where they are. And then I think that also probably has given them coping skills for the future years, which hopefully from an Arsenal perspective puts them in good stead. I think when you look at the whole journey from 2019 to now, you see a team that's a lot more disciplined. Charlie mentioned where they would go away from home and you wouldn't be surprised if they lost 5-0, which they did away to Manchester City. I think they started the season with 3 losses in 21-22. But then you saw the nucleus was there with Saka, Smith Rowe, Gabriel Martinelli as well. So it's so nice to see most of those players still here, contributing majorly to what's going on. And also, I think from a kind of mental standpoint, I asked Arteta a couple of weeks ago about Jose Mourinho's phrase "football heritage," and just from a perspective of European football, because Arsenal haven't really had any, and now they're at a stage where they can finally start to build some. And he said that he'd rather it be kind of referred to in relation to winning the big trophies, but every team has to start somewhere. And Arsenal, with Arteta, started struggling in the Europa League, and now they're winning at the Bernabeu. So it's quite a nice kind of checkpoint in the journey.
In your mind, who feels like a player that's sort of on that kind of conversation? Not necessarily that any decisions have been made, but could be in that conversation to say, it's summer, thank you for your time, we need to reinvest and rebuild.
I think Trossard's probably the main one in my eyes. When you look at him and Martinelli, the age factor is just a big plus on Martinelli's side. And I think Trossard's done extremely well in his 2.5 years at Arsenal. But when you're looking at assets, basically, which is I really hated using that word, for a human being. But, I think he's probably the most valuable one that wouldn't hurt as much, if that makes sense, if he went. And then outside of that, you're looking at probably an Alexander Zinchenko who's not starting games, or not starting meaningful games. And then they also have players who will be coming back from loan that they still need to sell permanently. So Albert Sambi Lokonga, Nuno Tavares,
still on Arsenal's books. Oh my goodness!
Fabio Vieira.
Is Tavares still at Marseille,
Yes.
or is it? Oh.
No. He's at Lazio.
He's at Lazio now. Oh,
but
come on!
But these are all
Lazio,
players that are still on Arsenal's books and could, even though people have probably forgotten that, they can generate funds. So there's loads of players there.
The interesting thing with Arteta, or two things with Arteta with this though. One is it's interesting, you asking who might it be, but he's sprung some surprises before, hasn't he? Because someone like Kieran Tierney went from being God, he's the man, new contract, future Arsenal captain. You're gone. Yeah. You are not playing a minute. Aaron Ramsdale, new contract. what a guy.
Oh, not the Ramsdale.
Next week, sorry mate, you're number 2 and you're never playing again. And I think the one problem with Arteta is it's so blindingly obvious whether you're in or out, so that as a prospective buyer, you can kind of be but you've made it very obvious you don't rate this player at all. I mean, Zinchenko, if you're a buying club, you're kind of you give him no minutes. Clearly you want him out of the club. We're not really going to bid very much for him. And that's slightly what happened. Same as someone like Kieran Tierney. He's so clearly surplus to requirements. Arteta does not hide that. When you're out, you are out.
Right, gents, let's end it there. Art, Guillermo, and also Charlie, thank you for your time, as well as you guys for watching. Please make sure you like the video, also subscribe to the channel, and make sure you leave us a comment as well. We're back soon. If you want to watch more episodes of the show, please subscribe to the channel. We'll be joined by the likes of David Ornstein, Matt Slater, Adam Crafton, Carl Anker, and plenty more through the season. If you'd like to listen to the episodes in full in audio form, search The Athletic FC wherever you get your podcasts from.